I was recently having a conversation with one of our members about the subjects that are and are not covered inside of the requirements and specifications course. And in that conversation, our member asked a question that I think is really important for me to address for our community as a whole. And that question has to do with non-functional requirements. So the question was, I wanted to check if there will be a separate discussion for non-functional requirements in the course. Short answer to that question is no, but the more important question and the learning opportunity that we have from this question is to really understand what non-functional requirements are and why it is that they're not going to get much attention in the requirements and specifications course. Okay, so before we dive into this, I want to make sure that we have total clarity on what a functional versus non-functional requirement is. And so with functional requirements, essentially, the majority of the business requirements that you produce are functional requirements because, or they should be functional requirements, because the functional requirements are really the things that your business stakeholders are going to need your product or your system to do, right? So it's in the name itself in that these are the functions that the system is going to have to perform to satisfy certain business needs, all right? So a lot of times when a user says, hey, I don't have the capability to do this today, that's a capability that I'm going to need out of the system. That capability itself is now a functional requirement because that capability is something that the system is going to have to allow your end users to be able to do. And so there are, in the course, we'll talk about there are a couple of different types of functional requirements that we're going to go through when we talk about the structure of requirements, but functional requirements are essentially the things that your system has to do. System usually takes some sort of an input, it does some sort of a processing, or it executes some business logic or some application logic, produces usually some sort of an output. That is a functional requirement, all right? Now, the non-functional requirements refer more to the qualities that your system should possess. And the types of qualities that typically get talked about in certain areas about around the areas of non-functional requirements are the ones that we have up on the board here. And so typically, if you do a Google for non-functional requirements, you'll typically come up with a list that looks very similar to this. It might have a couple of extra items, might be missing a couple of these items, but generally speaking, these are more of the characteristics, or you might think they are the characteristics that the product or the solution should have. And so the reason why I will try to encourage you to not spend too much time on non-functional requirements has to do with the fact that there are a couple of reasons why non-functional requirements are not that important, okay? Number one is because of the fact that many of the things that non-functional requirements aim to do are actually problems that are solved in other areas of the organization. So if we go back to the list of our non-functional requirements, for example, if we talk about things like performance or availability, if you work for any type of a medium or large size organization, your organization most likely has certain quality standards for the applications that they build or the applications that they configure and maintain. They already have certain quality standards that they have to adhere to, and those quality standards will typically talk about things like uptimes for the applications that they have, or they'll talk about response times, what kind of response times are and are not acceptable for applications, right? And so a lot of times those types of requirements or non-functional requirements that get talked a lot about, those types of things are already built into the organization's existing processes. And the majority of them tend not really to be at the business analyst or even at the developer level. A lot of them tend to be at what is called the infrastructure level. And the infrastructure group inside your organization is the group of people who are charged, or their responsibility is to maintain the server level hardware and software that's required at the server and infrastructure level, storage, network, right? In some organizations, telephones. They maintain the basic infrastructure that supports the applications that your end users use. So it's actually a level lower than even the development or anything that has to do with software development or software configuration. And so for most organizations that have a certain level of maturity in infrastructure, and most organizations are much more mature in the infrastructure layer than they are at the development and at the analysis layers, because of the fact that infrastructure is so critical to most of the organization. Because of those facts, the organization typically has a lot of those quality standards that are already in place. If you have ever been exposed to organizations or certifications related to ITIL, for example, those ITIL standards, many of them are oriented around making sure that they have certain quality standards at the infrastructure level, where a lot of these types of non-functional requirements would normally take place. And again, most infrastructure groups, most DevOps groups and infrastructure groups inside an organization typically have much more mature processes in place. And that is part of the reason why non-functional requirements on most projects for business analysts are typically not really required, not really something that you should be paying too much attention to. Now, the second reason for for you not really paying too much attention to non-functional requirements has to do with what is typically referred to in the industry as internal SLAs. And SLAs are service level agreements. And what a service level agreement essentially is an agreement between two different divisions or two different groups inside an organization that determines what service levels should be. Okay, so if we were to go back to our list of the non-functional requirements, when you start to get into areas, when you start to talk about things like maintainability, in a lot of areas, when you start to talk about things like, again, availability and performance, sometimes scalability, those types of issues are typically issues that in most organizations that have a certain level of maturity, those types of issues are dealt with at a much higher level. So at your director or at your VP level in your organization, chances are that your organization already has some pre-established internal service level agreements with the customers that you're trying to deliver a solution for. And a lot of those SLAs will talk about, and they will actually predetermine what it is, how much time it is going to take, for example, to implement some sort of a change request within your organization, which has to do with maintainability. They'll talk about what is going to happen if you have a large surge in the users that need to be supported by the application, which would talk about scalability. So again, a lot of the issues that the non-functional specifications are meant to actually address, those issues are typically in most medium to large size organizations are non-issues. So even if you were to get a requirement from a customer that says we need the system to be able to do, I don't know, let's say if you have a reliability or an availability one, if your customer says we need this thing to be up, 100% of the time, if you were to go to your infrastructure group with that kind of a requirement, your infrastructure group would probably say to you, look, we already have standards for our business applications and what those standards are. Your customer doesn't really have much of a say. If our standards are not up to what they need, then we have to find some workarounds, okay? But you documenting and trying to push through non-functional requirements a lot of times is going to hit a dead end very quickly because of some of the reasons that I have listed here. Now, with all of this said, there are certain exceptions to this rule, okay? As always, there are certain exceptions to this rule, and these exceptions really have to do with the interaction that you might have with external customers. So for example, if you work for a software company, and especially if you're a software company that offers your product on the cloud, then you may be required to start to address some of the non-functional requirements. Why? Because your organization is going to need to be able to give the external customers the confidence that what it is that you're building is going to be up to quality standards, right? So in that case, you don't have internal standards that you can rely on to be able to fulfill that gap. You don't have internal SLAs, you don't have internal infrastructure quality standards. And in those cases, you may now be required to start dealing with your external customers and taking the non-functional requirements that they have into your own organization to make sure that your organization can fulfill those requirements, right? And again, this is more relevant for analysts who work for software companies, or if you work for consulting companies that do software implementation for external customers, then you have a possible exception there. The other possible exception is if you are working for a regular organization, a non-software or consulting organization, where you are purchasing a piece of software from an external vendor. Now you're on the other side of things. Now you have to be able to hold your vendors to account for meeting certain quality standards. And then in those situations, then you may need to be able to actually detail out some of the non-functional requirements that your customers have, because of the fact that you do not have a lot of these internal quality standards, right? You're purchasing a piece of software from an external company. Your internal quality standards may not apply if that external company is going to be hosting that application on the cloud for your company. Then that's when your non-functional requirements start to become a little bit more important, right? You don't have any internal SLAs because you are now the group that's purchasing software from somebody else. Your internal SLAs are just not even relevant in that case. So that is the second exception. The third exception to that, and for the second exception especially, I've said here, especially if you're on the cloud. So non-functional requirements, many of them really have to do with quality of uptimes, response times, things like that, especially if you're purchasing a piece of software that your vendor is going to continue to host and maintain. Your non-functional requirements are now meant to get agreement to make sure that their internal infrastructure group has certain quality standards, right? So you need to still have that agreement with your external vendors. Now, when you hit certain what are called mission critical needs, in those cases, then you may need to start addressing some non-functional requirements. And mission critical, usually there's a very high standard for what is mission critical. And I'll give you an example to kind of bring that point home, because for most business applications, the types of quality standards that they look for, or the types of non-functional requirements they have, are typically, even if you don't hit those standards, a lot of times the impact to the organization isn't that big. If somebody's trying to produce a report that needs to crunch a lot of data, for example, and that takes 2 minutes instead of 30 seconds, a lot of times most organizations can live with that, right? Because these are internal reports, they can really kind of absorb the impact. It doesn't affect a lot of external clients. You're not going to get unhappy clients, things like that, right? But mission critical, let me give you an example of a mission critical application that I worked on in the past. So if you've seen my resume video, then you already know that I used to work for a company that builds and refurbishes nuclear power plants, okay? Now, one of the projects that I worked on was a custom-built application that helped the team, right? The team that is actually refurbishing a nuclear power plant. Essentially, what a refurbishment of nuclear power plant is they go into an existing running nuclear power plant, they shut it down, they go into the reactor core, and they start replacing parts inside of the reactor core, okay? Now, our application that we were building for that team was a work monitoring system to make sure that they're tracking each and every activity that they perform on the reactor core face, so that they are being able to maintain the work, and that their work is actually being tracked, and there's an actual audit trail of all of the steps that have been performed, right? Now, because of the fact that that refurbishment team was a 24/7 operation, they had a requirement to say that we cannot have any downtime of this application, because they basically had rotating shifts where the work never stopped. There was constantly work that's being done by those customers on the reactor face 24/7 for the duration of the entire project that they're running, right? And so the application that we had to provide for them, their requirement to us was that we cannot afford to have any downtime. Now, again, we, as an IT group, we had certain quality standards, or we had certain operational standards inside of our organizations that said that that is absolutely not possible, right? For the type of applications and application support that we provide, we cannot guarantee you 24 uptime all the time. There is really very few IT organizations in the world that can really guarantee that. We weren't one of them. And so what we had to do was that non-functional requirement then became a functional requirement. How? What we had to do essentially to be able to make sure that they can get that or that they can have a workaround was to build an export feature, which now becomes a functional requirement. We had to build an export feature that allows them to completely export their work plans into a document that they can print and that they can continue to track the work on paper if there is ever a need to take the system down. So if we needed to do an enhancement, or if we needed to push something into production that required maybe the system to go down for even 20 or 30 minutes, that would have had a huge impact on their work. And so we had to be very careful about how we were pushing those changes through. And on top of that, that non-functional requirement that they had actually became a functional requirement because we had to now add additional scope to what we had to build inside of that custom built application to help them meet whatever need that it is that they have. All right, so that example is an example of a mission critical application, right? Every hour that they were spending on the reactor phase was costing massive amounts of money to that organization. And so if our application was responsible for work stoppage or anything else at the reactor phase when they were doing their work, would have been a huge issue. And so that is how we got around what is called a mission critical business need. But again, these types of things tend to be very, very rare for the types of projects that we work on, because most business analysts that get hired are hired into doing things that are business related, right? Business related applications typically have a much higher tolerance for things like downtime than these types of mission critical applications do. And that, again, even though that this is an exception, because of the fact that it can be so rare for you to be on that type of a project, also brings home the fact that non-functional requirements really aren't any thing that you should be spending a significant amount of time on. And the reasons, again, for that are because most of the non-functional requirements are already addressed by other areas in your organization. And even if you were to take a non-functional requirement and to try to bring it to certain groups, you might get the response where your group might say to you, look, please just leave us alone. We know how to deal with this, focus on the functional stuff, right? That's a very common response that you might receive from your own internal teams if that ever happens. So that's the one reason. The other reason is again, it's because even if those quality standards are a lot of times not met for most business applications that we have, the impact to the organization really isn't huge unless it's really one of those mission critical applications. And so that is the reason that in our requirements and functional specifications course, we do not spend any time on non-functional requirements. This is something that we put very, very far back on the back burner. We recognize that they exist, but then we also recognize the fact that as business analysts, we have many more important things that we need to learn before we get down to non-functional requirements. All right, so I hope that explaining things in this way is making it clear, because again, if you were on the internet, you were searching around, or if you were to read certain types of books that talk about non-functional requirements, a lot of times they will not explain to you that non-functional requirements in a real industry practice perspective are really not that important for most business applications, right? They will typically hold it to the same weight that functional requirements do, and there is absolutely no competition there. There's no competition. Non-functional requirements should be at the very, very back burner of your learning strategy, and it is definitely going to be on the back burner of what it is that we're going to be teaching here at BA Blocks for the reasons that I've mentioned. All right, so if you have any questions about this, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to clarify anything that's related to non-functional requirements for you.